Drag queens. The term drag originated in the late 19th century as a British theatrical slang describing the sensation of long skirts dragging on the floor during male to female performances. Drag exists on a vast spectrum, with artists cultivating unique performances, styles, and aesthetics. Which leads us to the question, how has acceptance towards queer communities changed since the rise of queer culture, such as the more present image of drag queens in American media?
Let's start at the beginning. In 1869, drag balls began and became a safe place for gay men to socialize. Drag balls were deemed illegal and immoral by mainstream society. They passed laws that said bars couldn't have gatherings of more than 3 queer people. Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler were 2 writers who appreciated the drag balls. Historian George Chauncey made a statement about Harlem enhancing the gay world. In 1870, the word drag was being used as slang in the theater. The word drag originated from Elizabethan England within Shakespearean scripts. Drag was not considered an art form until the end of the 1800s. The drag balls were known as the pansy craze.
Before the dramatic increase in underground queer culture, discrimination towards people of the LGBTQ+ communities was almost normalized in the United States. In the 1950s and 1960s, many cities had laws that criminalized cross-dressing. Queer spaces were often raided by the police and disrespected by bystanders. Despite the heavy discrimination, underground queer culture was able to form in major cities, a major example being New York City. In New York, drag performers and queer people of color created secret spaces to express themselves safely in a society that made being themselves a risk. However, during the rise of ballroom culture, the AIDS epidemic unfortunately took the already harsh homophobia that was and is prevalent in our society and made it 10 times worse. Many performers were killed by sheer hatred and the widespread fear of AIDS. And law enforcement was not acting quickly enough to make people feel secure.
Ballroom culture grew out of drag balls that existed since the early 1900s. But the modern ballroom scene really developed in the 1960s when performers like Crystal LaBeija created spaces specifically for queer people of color who faced racism in mostly white drag races. These specific modernized ballrooms later became known as houses, which acted as found families for LGBTQ+ members who had lost theirs. They were led by mothers and fathers who kind of ruled over the houses, most often being the queen who won the most shows or had the most influence in the house. One of the most well-known houses of the time was the House of Extravaganza, founded by Hector Valle. By the 1980s, ballroom and house culture had become much larger and more organized, leading to the internal competitions focused on fashion, dance, beauty, and realness, which is acting in a way that no one will believe that you were queer or in drag. Voguing also became a major part of ballroom culture, based on the poses of the popular Vogue magazine.
Get closer. Your mouth. There you go.
So sorry.
There you go.
It was a dance often used to solve disputes on the dance floor rather than in your face on the streets. Another major event was the release of the documentary Paris is Burning, which introduced the culture to a wider range of audiences and helped people gain perspective on the queer community in general. This scene was strongest throughout the 1980s and 1990s and has evolved to become almost mainstream in recent years. However, due to the AIDS crisis and the increase in violence against the queer community, they had to go back into hiding again, and ballroom culture mostly died out. However, shows such as RuPaul's Drag Race brought back the culture, allowing it to be extremely popular today. People who went out or liked to have more of a social life were affected when there is a great shift and rise of queer acceptance and pride. Of course, LGBTQ communities were affected immediately, and the sudden increase in visibility. Many Americans became more accepting of queer peoples and drag culture. Pride events began to emerge as well. The reaction of the international community was supportive in a lot of ways. However, some countries remained opposed to LGBTQ rights and drag performances, especially because it was a more conservative era when drag queens were uprising.
Conservative lawmakers since at least the 19th century, when the first recorded attempts to restrict drag were made, have been wrinkled. LGBTQ activism increased a lot, especially because of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. In the 1980s and 1990s popularized queer culture through film, music, and nightclubs with drag performances. Over the past 15 years, queer communities have gained more visibility and influence. Drag became mainstream with the help of RuPaul's Drag Race. Support for LGBTQ rights and same-sex marriage saw an increase after the court case Obergefell-Hodges. They also received some political backlash against queer people from the public, who did not agree with this court decision that granted for the fundamental right to marry for same-sex couples. The LGBTQ+ community was obviously affected by this vast increase in representation and acceptance of queer people. Drag performers gained popularity and career opportunities, many becoming full-time performers. Conservative groups pushed back and continue to do so against these progressive changes.
Society began to accept queer identities a lot more than before, and representation increased in culture, especially with the help of social media. With the help of drag queens, self-expression and non-traditional gender roles became normalized in this generation.